Okay, hi everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. I think I make it about 12:01, so I think we'll get started. Thank you for joining us for day one, year two of the Harper McLeod Marine Economy Week. We were delighted with the support and feedback from our first event last year that we decided to host it again this year. So welcome to those of you who did attend last year and a new welcome to those who didn't. My name's Chris Kerr. I lead up the Marine Economy team at Harper McLeod. We've got a full week ahead of content aimed at covering as much as we can of the diverse marine economy sector. So what are we talking about when we talk about marine economy? Some refer to it as the blue economy, but essentially it's anything to do with water. Scottish Government published their version of Blue Economy Vision for Scotland, and that was just 4 or 5 weeks ago. And as part of that, they identified in their definition that it was a very broad area, and they've actually identified it as being 25 subcategories. That's broadly how we choose to talk about it in the context of marine economy at Harper McLeod. We've got many clients who operate in what we regard as being that sector across all of our chosen geographies, and it's something which I and a number of my colleagues get involved in on a day-to-day basis. But effectively, to bring it to life in some shape, it's the marine economy is part of our rural economy. It can be anything to do with the training of marine cadets, through to the owners and operators of fish farms, through to all of the supply chains associated with the aquaculture world, then in turn through to ports and harbours operators, offshore renewable developers, marine tourism, the designers and R&D technicians behind all of these areas. So you'll see, you get the picture, it's a very broad and diverse sector. The coastline of Scotland, I believe, runs to about 19,000 kilometres. The marine economy itself equates to about 3% of Scotland's jobs and generates, according to Scottish Government numbers, about 5 billion of the GVA. So it's clearly something that's very important to Scotland, to the UK, and more broadly worldwide. Over the course of the week, we've got, as I said, a packed content. Each day we're going to be exploring a different part of the marine economy sector. So tomorrow we're looking at ports and harbours. Wednesday we're looking at innovation. Thursday we're looking at offshore renewables. And on Friday, one of my immigration and employment law colleagues are talking to a couple of stakeholders in the marine skills and resources world. So I'll tell you more about that as we go. But what we thought would be useful was to kick off our first day. I'm joined by 3 colleagues who we thought it would just be useful to almost kind of look in the rearview mirror and talk about the headlines that have hit the press in the last year or so that relate to the marine economy sector, and both in Scotland and further afield. And that, I think, just is hopefully a good scene setter for the week ahead. Just before I go to brief introductions, just to say, you'll see it's the usual format that everyone's now aware of, that it is possible to raise questions or put comments in the chat box. Please feel free to do that, and we'll try and tackle those as we go. So let's do some quick fire intros. Come to you first, please, Omar.
Thanks, Chris. My name's Omar Ali. I'm a partner in Harper McLeod's energy team, acting for a wide variety of developers, funders, and investors in renewable energy projects, both onshore and offshore.
Thanks, Omar. Tony?
Hi, I'm Tony Cameron. I'm a partner and head of the banking finance team here at Harper McLeod, and we act for a range of lenders and funders and borrowers across the full range of the marine economy.
And Jill.
Hi everyone, my name's Jill Flower. I'm one of the partners based in our Inverness office. I specialise in commercial contracts, including in relation to the marine economy area. And competition law is also one of my practice areas, particularly public procurement and subsidy control, which used to be the previous EU state aid rules.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks, guys. Nice to see you all. Right, let's kick off the discussion in terms of what some of the things we've seen and or have hit the headlines over the last year or so. Omar, I'm going to come to you first. It seems to me that one of the biggest news stories is the Scotland leasing programme, both, I suppose, for its importance to the marine economy world, but also in terms of its overall benefits in climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, if we go back to June 2020, Crown Estate Scotland announced the launch of the first round of offshore wind leasing in Scottish waters in a decade, called ScotWind Leasing, which enabled companies to apply and build Scotland's new generation of offshore wind farms. Option agreements set out the terms on which developers will be granted a lease to construct and operate an offshore wind farm on the seabed, and Crown Estate Scotland receive and deal with applications for the award of option agreements. There were delays to the ScotWind process last year, largely due to the outcome of the Crown Estate England Round 4 offshore leasing, where option fees were part of the bid process, and almost £900 million per annum was secured for 6 offshore sites with a combined capacity of 8 gigawatts. Crown Estate Scotland took note of this, and with the support of the Scottish Government, decided it would be sensible to review their option structure so that a fair price was being paid for offshore wind sites in Scotland. The closing date for applications was July last year, and in January this year, the results of ScotWind were finally released. The round was expected to deliver up to 10 gigawatts of offshore wind in Scottish waters, and it was fiercely contested, and there were 74 bids on 15 sites. 2 of the sites have multiple projects, so there will be 17 projects in total from major international companies such as BP, Shell, SSE and Scottish Power. The actual capacity of the round exceeded expectations, with nearly 25 gigawatts of projects and 60% of the projects being floating offshore wind. The scale of floating wind projects in this round will make Scotland one of the largest markets in the world for this emerging technology, and offers the potential for a large proportion of the components for these wind farms to be manufactured in Scotland. In April, Crown Estate Scotland confirmed that all bidders who were offered seabed leases in January had accepted the contractual terms offered and had signed up option agreements. £700 million will be paid by the successful applicants in option fees and will be passed to the Scottish Government for public spending. The 17 projects will now commence development work in advance of submitting applications to the Scottish Government, and many of these projects have already started wider engagement, including with the Scottish supply chain. ScotWind has been widely welcomed as contributing towards Scotland moving towards a net zero economy, and has been described by the Scottish Government as a once-in-a-generation opportunity which has to be realised and maximised. We'll be talking more about ScotWind and how this will be delivered, together with the challenges it will face, on the Marine and Offshore Renewables Day on Thursday, with William Black, who is the Deputy Director of Energy Strategy and Energy Consents at the Scottish Government.
Thanks, Omar. And of course, the announcement of the results came on the back of the COP Climate Change Summit in Glasgow, didn't it? So all positive, I guess, for Scotland. Tony, just sticking with the offshore theme, do you want to tell us what you're seeing on the banking and finance side?
Yeah, thanks. Afternoon, everyone. In terms of the offshore side, we've been involved in several offshore wind projects, but in terms of Scotland specifically, with the option agreements just signed, we're really expecting that from this point onwards, and probably for a number of years, to start then get involved in financing discussions around those projects as they develop and get planning, etc. So that's something that we think is going to come down the line. As I mentioned earlier, we do funding work across the whole marine economy, and we've had a busy year again across all of those areas. In terms of renewables, we've added in several hydro projects. In addition, we do a significant amount of work in vessels. We're involved in sales and purchases, new build vessels and refinancing, and that's included as part of the pelagic fleet in Shetland. And also, probably worth mentioning, we've been involved with borrowers and lenders in a few notable ports and harbours projects throughout the course of the year too. One of the projects we've been involved in over the last number of years is a notable year, and that's the Orbital Marine O2 floating tidal turbine. I'm sure many people on the call have seen the images of the that being towed from Dundee, where it was launched, up to Orkney, where it's now grid connected at EMEC. We acted for the ethical investment platform Abundance in relation to the 7 million debenture raised to support the development of that project, acting on all of the debt security and the diligence aspects of it. And that funding's really allowed this turbine, which is groundbreaking, world-leading technology, to go into the last stage of its development and really to allow that innovative project to get to a conclusion. We've added for Abundance actually in several projects where they're effectively unlocking the ability to get funding for green infrastructure projects. I think, Omar, you've maybe got a bit more to say on renewable tech and maybe a little bit about that orbital project too.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Interest in tidal-based energy systems is growing. However, the current footprint of the industry and its technologies is quite small. I mean, as Tony mentioned, last July saw a major step forward for the UK's marine energy sector as the world's most powerful tidal turbine developed by Orbital Marine Power started grid-connected power generation at the European Marine Energy Centre in Orkney. The turbine has a capacity of 2 megawatts and will operate in the waters off Orkney for the next 15 years and will have the ability to meet annual electricity demand of around 2,000 UK homes. The turbine will also send power to a land-based electrolyser that will generate green hydrogen. If we look to October last year, the 50 megawatt Kincardine offshore wind farm, which is located 15 kilometres off the coast of Aberdeenshire, one of the world's largest floating wind farms to date, became fully operational. And in January, the UK government announced more than £31 million of government funding to drive forward plans for floating offshore wind, and it will be matched by more than £30 million of industry funding, which will help accelerate renewable energy deployment of floating turbines in seas in all parts of the country. The UK is already home to the world's largest deployment of offshore wind. However, floating turbines, which can be deployed in deeper waters than conventional turbines, will boost energy capacity even further by allowing wind farms to be situated in new areas around the UK coastline where wind strengths are at their highest and most productive. Floating offshore wind has also been supported by the fourth allocation round of the Contracts for Difference scheme, where £24 million a year has been ring-fenced for this emerging technology. The offshore wind market is undergoing rapid expansion. In 2007, there were 7 nations with offshore turbines, and by 2027, there's predicted to be 18. Significant innovations in technology to make wind farms more economically viable have seen the size of turbines increase. If you look back about 15 years ago, the average offshore wind turbine had a capacity of 3 megawatts, and today the average capacity is 6 megawatts. There are manufacturers who are selling 9 megawatt turbines and testing turbines with a capacity of 14 megawatts. So fewer, larger turbines are more cost effective, and it will continue to increase demand for larger turbines over smaller ones. And that means there will be a major focus for both developers and contractors on supply chain issues as the market grows worldwide, and the pressure to engage local supply chains will result in big challenges going forward. The uptake of offshore wind in the UK and globally will lead to increased demand for factory manufacturing slots for key components, and therefore early engagement with procurement is going to be vital to avoid delays arising from wider availability issues. The larger capacity of turbines causes an issue in terms of specialised vessels that are going to be large enough to cope with the new turbines, and also the number of vessels in shipyards required to meet the number of turbines forecast. We will be exploring the supply chain and floating wind in further detail on Thursday with Andy MacDonald, who's a Director of Offshore Wind Development and Operations for ORE Catapult.
Thanks, Omar. I suppose just stretching that point about marine tech, I'm aware we've got an increasing, or seem to have an increasing number of clients who are developing subsea technology, whether it be for defence, security or other marine purposes, as well as having an increasing number of clients who are focused on the aquaculture innovation and all things R&D around that. Jill, you've been seeing a fair bit of activity in relation to aquaculture. Do you want to just jump in there and tell us a little bit about what you've seen in the last period?
Yes, of course. Thanks very much. So innovation and development is absolutely key, I think, across the marine economy, but particularly in relation to aquaculture. One particularly interesting and topical development has been the recent establishment of the Seaweed Academy by the Scottish Association for Marine Science down in Oban. And they've got a remit of helping startups in this area, training staff and personnel, sharing research, and it's absolutely an area with huge potential for Scotland. I've been advising on various contractual arrangements for various businesses in this sector, including joint venture agreements with academia. But seaweed harvesting is just part of the larger aquaculture sector, where I'm regularly advising on the entire supply chain contractual issues, from the production of eggs and smolt right through to fish health products, how to keep the products healthy, contracts for barges, for nets, right through to harvesting, transport, processing of products and distribution, whether that's domestic or international. I would say it's been a challenging year for businesses in this sector in terms of the ongoing consequences of Brexit, and particularly in relation to exporting difficulties. Although I would say that we're in a better position than we were a year ago, or certainly 2 years ago. COVID's also had an impact, as it has with businesses in every sector. And recruitment, particularly because of Brexit, continues to be an issue for this sector. But I would say that the industry in general is doing really well. There's lots of demand for these products. There's some shortages of sites, and the Scottish Government is looking at changing the licensing regime going forward to try and increase productivity and make it even more competitive.
Thanks, Jo. Well done. We made it 17 minutes without mentioning Brexit or COVID.
Apologies.
You mentioned seaweed. Tony, you and I were at the Aquaculture UK conference last week, and certainly one of the ladies from the Seaweed Academy was awarded there in one of the categories. Do you want to just give us your thoughts on what you saw as being main themes coming from the conference?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think that lady won the Rising Star, didn't she, the first of the awards? I think the first observation is probably just the scale of the scale and breadth of the industry from that event, both in terms of the number of stands, number of people at the awards that evening, which is, I think we thought numbered around about 700. And actually the number of awards categories as well, just in terms of the breadth of the industry, of that part of the industry. In terms of themes, I think the three main things to mention are probably headline themes are sustainability, innovation and collaboration, including the work of organisations like the Sustainable Aquaculture Innovation Centre and, as Jill mentioned, the Scottish Society of Marine Science down in Oban. So I think those come through. Other things that we heard people talking about, we discussed with them when we were there, digital transformation and data capture and the importance of that going forward, alternative infrastructure, sustainable feed and local supply chains, and then definitely another theme coming through is external cost pressures in terms of energy costs, supply chain and inflation. I suppose talking in a wider sense about aquaculture, one of the other big topics clearly is the Griggs Review. You're probably aware that Professor Russell Griggs was commissioned to undertake an independent review of the regulatory regime in Scotland for aquaculture, and that was published in February this year. The headline from that is, I think, pretty critical of the current regime. Multiple public bodies, multiple laws and regulators, and considerable overlap in what is an industry that is quickly, rapidly developing and changing. I think there's also noted in the sub-headlines of that review the level of distrust between the various interested parties, be that Scottish Government, regulators, industry and other stakeholders. For example, the Scottish Government has seen by some as being too close to industry, but by others as being anti-industry, anti the aquaculture industry. So I think all of that was identified and needing to find a way through. But one of the things that's noted is that almost everyone has spoke to Professor Griggs noted that the current regulatory regime is not fit for purpose. The key recommendations that came out of that review included having different regulatory regimes for finfish, shellfish and seaweed based on the specific requirements of that bit of the industry, having a single website and body for all inquiries about aquaculture regulation. The plan is to set up a project board of Scottish Government and relevant counterparties to produce a 10-year framework over the next 12 months. I suppose tying back to one of the thematic comments, there's identified a need for innovation and development and making sure that costs and timings of the regulatory process encourage that. Also interesting is the wish to have a social contract as part of any consenting regime, take account of community interests, and then a single licensing payment regime based on tonnage, but which allows for the cost of the regime, the cost of future research in order to keep the regime up to date and relevant, and also including costs that can be fed back as part of, sort of community disbursements. So I think all that's really interesting. I think the plan is to try and implement at least some of that prior to the Scottish Government issuing its Vision for Aquaculture document, which is in the stocks. One final point, I suppose, just to mention, based on the footprint of our practice, is that it's identified that Shetland would be a suitable location for a pilot programme for any regulatory regime change based on the footprint of the industry in that area. So I think that maybe just covers some of the kind of headline issues that we kind of picked up on coming out of that conference and awards dinner, Chris.
Thanks, Tony. As you said, it was quite impressive to see 700 people from the industry back face-to-face at the awards dinner. I think it says something about what people's confidence in both the next stage of post-pandemic, hopefully, but also the sector itself. Joe, I'm going to come back to you. There was a point you made earlier, and I think Omar mentioned procurement as well. I just wondered if you can elaborate on that, because that seems to be something that's been hitting the press over the last year.
Yes, absolutely. As you say, there's been some recent high-profile examples of the difficulties and challenges of procurement in the marine sector, to mention Ferguson Marine as one. But obtaining value for money is absolutely important for all purchasers, whether they're subject to the detailed formal procurement rules or not. And I think given the economic uncertainty that we have at the moment and that we're likely to have for some time, I think obtaining good commercial deals is going to become increasingly important. Depending on the status and nature of the person who's doing the purchasing, they may be required to comply with more detailed procurement rules. So, for example, government bodies are obliged to do so, and some ports and harbours are obliged to do so, depending on their constitution and status.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Joe. And I suppose using that as the link to something else that's been in the press is the discussion around free ports. So for those of you who have been following this discussion, the spring budget of 21, the Chancellor announced there was going to be the new concept of free ports introduced in England. So there are now 8 of them, one of which is actually inland. And these are effectively free tariff zones to encourage employment and lower import-export tax reliefs. The Scottish Government's position for that is, which was announced, I think it was February this year, is something that is now called green free ports. So essentially the same idea, but the idea is that there's going to be 2 of these in Scotland. And again, for those of you who are following this, you'll be aware that the bidding process for those 2 green free ports is currently underway. There's a number of names in the frame around the country as to likely bidders and indeed who's likely to be successful. So hopefully should be good for jobs and trade. it'll be interesting as well to see, I suppose, how they interact, the Scottish ones interact with the English, the 8 English ones. If I move on from free ports, then just sticking with kind of headlines in this arena, Tony, the Scottish budget had, I suppose there was a fair bit of content in there that was relevant to marine economy. Do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, sure, Chris. On 9th December 21, the Scottish Government published the Scottish budget for the year 22-23. And as you identify, Chris, there's various commitments in respect to the marine economy in that under the Rural Affairs and Islands portfolio. Overall, more than 650 million of ongoing support is in there for agriculture, fishing and seafood sectors. So just breaking down those figures, fishing and aquaculture, the equipment there remains the same as the previous year at 20.4 million, albeit that remains well up on the 2021 figure of 5.9 million. In terms of marine, generally that's up from 86.1 to 95.9 million, so a good jump there, and a considerable jump on from where it was 65 million or so in 2021. There are several aims, objectives contained in the budget commentary as well, just around the marine economy that are probably worth touching on. So those include developing a strong blue economy, ensuring good environmental status for all of Scotland's marine waters, moving towards net zero and climate resilient economy through the transition of various areas, including marine, in order to meet the 2045 emissions targets. And other key aims included investment in island communities, mitigation impacts of Brexit. Sorry, I've second reference to Brexit today, apologies. And creating resilient rural, coastal and island communities, businesses and initiatives. So there's a lot there that I think ties into the Blue Economy Vision document, Chris, that you mentioned earlier. But also, I think that's all quite interesting, again, in the context of our practice, and in particular the Northern Islands footprint around some of that rural and coastal island communities. So I think those were really the headlines for marine economy from the Scottish budget.
Okay, and any other funding initiatives or packages?
Yeah, probably a few things to mention. The European Maritime and Fisheries Fund is now no longer accepting applications post-Brexit. There we go again. However, Marine Fund Scotland has replaced that, and that's got an annual budget of 14 million, albeit that's less than the previous EMFF funding. There's a few other things to mention. The UK Seafood Fund, which is a 100 million fund to support long-term future and sustainability of the UK fisheries and seafood sector. And that's also, under that, there are fishing industry science partnerships where funding is made available, and the most recent of those closed on 25th of April this year. Another one is the Seafood Business Improvement Programme, and that's run by Seafood Scotland, and that's to allow the onshore seafood businesses funded training programmes. The UK government's also got a 20 million per year programme to invest in tidal stream electricity, which is another interesting one. And probably the final one is Green Offshore Tech Programme, which is a programme in which Highlands Islands Enterprise is a partner. And that's open to SMEs with the aim to make offshore products and transport greener, cleaner and more sustainable. The intention of that is to encourage cross-sectoral collaboration, tying back to that theme I've mentioned earlier, enabling tech to develop sustainable products and processes. And that's across 4 different areas. That's agriculture, renewables, oil and gas, and waterborne transport. And again, that was quite interesting how it ties back to a number of the other themes that we've talked about already today.
Thanks, Tony. Jill, is is there something to pick up on from what Tony said there about subsidies?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's really, really positive that there are so many sources of support for businesses across all these different subsectors of the marine economy. I would just caution that for anyone, any public body that's considering giving assistance, or for any business that's considering accepting it, we've got to bear in mind what's called the subsidy control rules, which are aimed at preventing distortion of competition, replace the previous EU state aid rules. We've been in a state of transition for the past couple of years, but the Subsidy Control Act was passed by the Houses of Parliament just a couple of weeks ago. So we've now got a new regime which will need to get embedded, but it's crucially important for anyone giving public assistance or receiving it that those rules are complied with, because otherwise the whole projects can be put into doubt.
I was just going to say, probably want to mention as well, Chris, that there's quite a range of different funding there, both in terms of budget and other initiatives. I dare say industry would always say there could be more and there should be more, but I think the spread's quite interesting, albeit I dare say there will be differing views on the appropriate level of support across industry and government.
Indeed. Just so that we haven't missed it, there is also a new act in the last year or so called the National Security and Investment Act, which part of that applies to ports and harbours in the event of any external investment, which just is all around, just as the name suggests, security issues and of strategic assets around the UK. So, which in turn probably ties to quite a lot of what else is going on in the world, where we're talking about ports and harbour security, and I mentioned earlier the subsea technology that has been developed for different purposes, including defence.
And I think, Chris, that will also be very relevant for any funding. And funders will be very exercised on making sure that aspect of diligence has been carefully looked at. Yeah,
good point. Okay, a couple of things that I feel we haven't mentioned, but have maybe been alluded to. There is the other thing that is in the press a lot at the moment is around decommissioning of the oil fields and kind of big oil generally, if you like. We certainly have been talking to a few clients who are involved in that in different ways, and you've seen in the press as well about successful decoms so far of some of the rigs in the North Sea coming into, say, for example, Lerwick up at Dalesvoe, and others are in the northeast of England, for example. So I think we're going to see more and more of that, albeit tying back to the earlier point about security of supply and energy security. That's still something that is clearly pretty topical and does feel like it's changing quite regularly in terms of where we may be going with that direction going forward. The other one, just again, sort of we've mentioned it because post-COVID, it's definitely seen a fillip in terms of its activity levels is marine tourism and just the leisure market more generally, as people have focused on staycations, and we've got clients in that sector who are reporting bumper numbers around their visitors. And needless to say, as a point Tony made earlier, they're also reporting though staff shortages, but also overheads have gone through the roof, as we're all talking about. So I think it's challenging in different ways, even if the numbers are coming back. Okay, I'm looking at the chat function. I can see a couple of questions coming in here. I've got one directed at you, Omar, and I think it's going back to your ScotWind discussion. How is the supply chain capacity going to be managed for the ScotWind project?
Yeah, I mean, a key part of ScotWind is to ensure that there is a focus at the outset on sort of supply chain capacity so that these projects can be developed and delivered. I mean, these are enormous projects. It could take up to a decade to get them up and running. And if you look back to the actual application stage, Crown Estate Scotland mandated that all the applicants were required to outline supply chain commitments as part of the overall application process, which detailed how applicants, could source things like products, materials, labour. So that would allow them to construct and erect and service, the fixed and floating offshore wind projects. And that's throughout the entire life cycle of the project. So right from the development stage all the way through to operation and maintenance, and also covering manufacturing and construction phases. And supply chain commitments they're updated throughout the whole development process of the project. So as the timing and technology becomes clearer, then the development of the supply chain then progresses. And that's been a key factor of Scotland.
Thanks, Omar. It does feel quite a generational project, doesn't it, in terms of it being a seismic shift and where we're going. Another question here, Tony, you touched upon communities and the funding packages available, but I think this question is probably better focused at Jill. Jill, how does the marine economy interact with local communities?
I think it's all about balance, and it's all about sustainability. And it is an issue that requires very careful consideration. A lot of these developments and projects can bring enormous benefits to fragile remote communities in terms of employment and economic opportunity, but it needs to be done in a way that the local community is engaged with the process and that they actually receive the benefits from it, and that it's not done at the expense of things like wildlife and landscape management or local businesses or communities. Tony already mentioned the Scottish Government's commitment to community benefit in terms of these projects. And Highlands and Islands Enterprise, in whose area a lot of these fragile and remote communities are, has always been really clear that it's not just an economic development agency, it's also got a social and community purpose as well. It's difficult to provide an answer kind of in the abstract, but it is a concern. It is something that I think a lot of the governing bodies are aware of, and that needs to be done in a proper way. And as well as receiving specific community benefit from particular projects, there's lots of funding available for local communities in terms of applying for grants, etc. There are definitely opportunities out there. It's just something that needs to be managed carefully, I think.
We have acted on quite a lot of community-based renewable schemes as well, haven't we, across the firm as well? So it's quite interesting.
Okay, thank you both. Right, I can't see any other questions in the chat box. So given the time, I think this is in keeping with the brief in terms of if we're going to just close off in another couple of minutes or so. So thank you again to all of you. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I do see another question. Yeah, will extra, sorry, this is from Peter Tate. Will extra harbour facilities and laydown areas be required in Orkney and Shetland areas? So, Omar, I think that will, if we link that to your point about the supply chain and for offshore Scotland. So just any anecdotes around what we're seeing? Yeah,
I mean, I think, the capacity is probably not great at the moment for what's to come in the next, 5 to 10 years. And there's definitely going to be needed, an upgrade to all the ports, harbours, as I mentioned before, the vessels as well that are going to be needed to service these projects. So I have no doubt that these ports and harbours are going to need significant upgrades, and that's something that we will discuss in further detail on Renewable Energy Day 4 of Marine Economy Week with William Black.
Thanks, Omar. I suspect it's also going to come up tomorrow at the Ports and Harbours Focus Day. For a number of years now, you have seen the ports and harbours around the UK kind of almost diversifying or sweating their asset in different ways. And we've certainly got client experience where we've acted for particular harbour trust authorities who've invested heavily in the asset in order to point at different audiences, if you like, for laydown areas and all the rest of it. So it does feel that there is a kind of, again, a direction of travel there that is likely to continue. particularly, I suppose, tying that to the Green Freeport discussion. So it may well be that the ones who are successful there will be the ones where you see most inward investment as a result of what they're trying to achieve. So thank you for that question. Okay, I think I will seek to draw us to a close at that point. Before I do, I'm just keen to make sure that you all know about what's happening the rest of the week. Omar has been very good at plugging day 4, the Marine Renewables Day. You might be able to tell that Omar is the one that's going to be hosting that with Andrew McDonald from ORE Catapult and William Black from Scottish Government. Tomorrow we have Ports and Harbours focus, so it will be a jam-packed session with Ivan McKee, the Minister for Business, Trade, Tourism and Enterprise. We've also got the Chief Executive of British Port Association, Richard Ballantyne, and one of the co-owners at Ardeshir Port Authority, who is Steve Regan. So the 3 of them will be joining me tomorrow, and that will, in my humble opinion, hopefully be very interesting in terms of the content that the 3 of those individuals will be able to add to the discussion. We focus on innovation on Wednesday. One of our Norwegian clients who is focused in, their sector is entirely in the aquaculture and pharmaceutical and treatment space. Hannah Mertens of Aquapharma Group will be talking to one of our colleagues, Jamie Watt, on Wednesday. And then jumping to Friday, 2 of our colleagues in the employment and immigration team are talking to Onboard Marine, who are a specialist recruitment sector operator in the marine sector, as well as one of the guys from Shetland Seafood Auction. So that's Friday, which is focusing on skills and resources. So hopefully you can join us for one or all of those. If it isn't too late to register, so please feel free to do so. Each of the sessions kicks off at 12 o'clock. And like today, we would hope that they are covered off within inside an hour. So just one final question from my marketing colleagues. They will be annoyed if I don't ask this. We are keen to know if you're finding virtual events still worthwhile. So please feel free to put any comments around that on the chat function or email any of us. Of course, the opposite being, would you prefer these to be face-to-face? And are you preferring to now return to face-to-face events? So we are interested in hearing your feedback on that, together with anything else, of course, that you think about today or the rest of the week's events if you do decide to attend. So meanwhile, thank you for your time. Hopefully we accompanied your sandwich, and thanks for joining us.